the Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, and we will be taking the next hour to look at another facet of what I like to call the culture of consciousness. Certainly the case that there's so many challenging, fascinating, tangled, and dense things to be thinking about these days. So many colliding discourses, so many multiple frames of how to organize and understand reality that it gets extremely dizzying. And for those of us who are trying to figure this stuff out on our own, trying to understand the world, develop workable maps and models, outside in the public sphere, it's often somewhat consternating that when we look across the walls into the world of official academics, into universities and the production of knowledge and scholarship and discourse, that it actually often seems sort of not altogether worthwhile. You would think that the universities and the academics who labor away at their careers, writing their journal articles and their books and teaching students would be the first folks we would turn to in order to get a clue about things. And yet, with some very important exceptions, of course, in all fields, there are always writers who are writing to be read and not merely to argue or climb their way up some obscure, arcane hierarchy of institutional politics. That nonetheless it becomes somewhat frustrating for those of us on the outside in terms of maintaining an open dialogue with the folks who have devoted their entire lives to studying anthropology or psychology or economics, or increasingly the networks that link these things. And really that's part of the problem, is that the structure of the production of knowledge inside the academy is slated for very understandable institutional and intellectual reasons towards the firming up of particular worldviews or particular fields. You know, I'm an anthropologist, and then within anthropology I study cultural anthropology, and within cultural anthropology I am an expert on South Asia, and in particular the confrontation of village life with urban life or something like that. And I do my research there, and that becomes my zone. And there's all these other academics around me who are doing similar things, and I have to know all their works, and I have to argue with them and try to figure out what's going on with these folks. And meanwhile, all these other fields of knowledge and all these other places and all these other zones of reality are going on, and if one is outside of the academy trying to figure out what's going on, you inevitably start drawing links between vast different fields because nobody's watching your ass. You can just do whatever you want to do. If I want to go from anthropology to psychology and try to understand how the economics of something works with information technology, well, no one's stopping me. But we don't see that kind of ferocity of multidimensional thinking so often in the academy. One great exception for that, however, is today's guest. Rich Doyle is an amazement. I don't understand how he does it. So I look forward very much to talking with him, and we're going to be straying all over the map. But before we do, I just want to introduce our co-host here, Maja Daou. And I think, Maja, you have an advanced degree. Am I not correct here?
Advanced?
Yeah.
I guess so. I do. I have degrees. I've been in school. I've done the whole university thing. I have a master's degree, almost 2 master's degrees. I was just short of getting a Oriental medicine degree as well. But I have a master's in transformational psychology. And I totally agree with everything you say, man. I never experienced more isolationism in topics in academia as when I was in a university, which seems like a place which would unite those things. But no. And one of my favorite examples of someone who was bummed about that is Schrodinger actually wrote this book called What is Life? And towards the end of his quantum physics career, he tried to go back to school for biology. And everybody just met him with opposition. Like, all the biologists were like, what? You can't study biology. You're a quantum physicist. What do you know about biology? And it was Schrodinger. I mean, come on. If even Schrodinger has, people closing their mind to him, like going to biology classes, I mean, that's really a big bummer. So I think anybody that in academia that can cross those lines and unify ideas, which to me, that is like, that's poetry, that's metaphor. When you can cross connections and say that something is like something else and see the unification in things, that's kind of like what it's all about for me. So I'm also very amazed by Rich and what he's doing.
Yeah, another way of looking at it besides just unification is almost more like resonance. It's like the way a figure in one field will resonate with a figure in another field. And you can't exactly say they're the same thing, but they're not different either. And so you set up these resonating points of connection. One final thing to say about this as we introduce Rich is just that, of course, it all depends on one's relationship to science. You know, within the sciences, if one is, working inside neuroscience, leaving aside the metaphor of anthropology, if you're working inside neuroscience, of course, there's tremendous pressure for you to specialize and to only be aware of what you're doing. And that leaves this whole issue of how the sciences relate to each other and to culture in this very open-ended way, because the people who go in there are often non-scientists, so the scientists don't pay attention. And it becomes a very kind of confusing but also very rich mixture, and that's one thing that Rich Doyle is really amazing at. I'm actually just going to read from his bio online on his Biotelemetrica website. Doyle teaches at Penn State University, and he teaches courses in the history and rhetoric of emerging technosciences, sustainability, space colonization, biotechnology, nanotechnology, psychedelic science, information technologies, biometrics, and the cultural and literary context from which they sprout. His books are wild and wonderful, and I think he's working on a new one, or new one's about. We'll hear more about that. So I just want to welcome Rich Doyle to Expanding Mind.
Wow, thanks, you guys. That was really amazing. Getting the password of Schrodinger was really resonant because, as you might know, it was Schrodinger who really set me off on this mad quest to find all the interconnections between all these forms of knowledge.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's
awesome. It really was. It was reading What is Life and reconstructing the effect that had on the creation and constitution of early molecular biology, because it was those lectures, circulated, and people like Watson and Crick, picked up on the sort of holy grail aspect of the code script in Schrodinger, and ignored a lot of the rest of it. But it was Schrodinger's ability as what he called a dilettante, but as an interdisciplinarian, to make a huge difference, because he was capable of it. Somehow he had this massive capacity to connect across texts. And I misread him the first 10 times I read him. I failed to pick up on his return late in that book, where he goes inside, where he recognizes the nature of introspection and what we might call first-person science, right? Mm-hmm. The investigation of self, as being crucial to the resolution of this paradox that he comes up against, which is between the truth of the mechanical description of the world on the one hand and the unmistakable experience of total creative freedom that he had on the other hand.
Oh, yeah, that part's amazing. Are you talking about like the passage where he describes the tree?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, it's
and
amazing,
he goes,
amazing.
Well, tell that passage.
Well, he talks about how, basically since Kant, we look out the window and we don't see the tree, we just see the representation of a tree. And he's trying to tell the story, basically a Gnostic story, Erik, of, how have we lost the reality of the tree? How can our knowledge system not be up to the task of acknowledging the treeness of the tree? And he goes to another equation where, because his famous equation was the equation for the collapse of the wave function, the Schrodinger equation. But then he goes to Atman equals Brahman as an equation to make sense of the simultaneity of this moment of both the tree out the window is just this mechanical unfolding of reality and a representation to my senses, right? And I am a participant in the unfolding of the reality of that tree. That tree is, for me, in a way that you might call authentic and experiential. So I think I'm paraphrasing this section there.
No, you're exactly right on. I mean, that's like, it's seriously impacted me tremendously the first time I read that, probably much like you. But, yeah, it's an amazing passage. If you guys can get a hold of that book, you should check it out.
Well, somehow it's available online in its entirety. So,
that's rad.
If you Google "What is Life?" HTML, I think you'll find it.
It's so wonderful to hear you say that, because there are so many mysteries and conundrums and inspiring knots of metaphysical weirdness inside of physics and quantum physics, and there's this inevitable move to try to weave the experiencer into it, and to even allow it to resonate with mystical or religious ways of seeing the world. But most of that work is done so shoddily. It's very nice to have it rooted in in a real deal situation. And I'm curious to hear from you, Rich. How did that inspire you? Like, how did that the crossing that line, which seems so important, it's so crucial these days, how did that set you going to look for other ways of making that leap?
Well, I think there was a lot of caution. Because I read a lot of that quantum physics stuff you're alluding to when in my late teens, and was really inspired by this vision that seemed to be in there, and for the connection between science and spiritual practice and philosophical practice. But I got to a point where I just I basically ran away from all of it for a while, because I couldn't tell anymore how to evaluate some of the arguments there. And I knew that I either was going to go and become a quantum physicist somehow, or I was going to focus my attention on something else. And I decided for a while to focus my attention on something else, because I actually wasn't even convinced that going to become a quantum physicist would help me evaluate the arguments, because I talked to people who were quantum physicists, and they seemed to feel like it didn't help much. But you know what? I couldn't get away from it. And it was through, in part, the reading of Philip K. Dick, who I was introduced to on my way out to Berkeley in the late 80s. Not literally introduced to, but somebody turned me on to his work. And I know you've been in that, the circulation of those texts and that wisdom for a long time. But somehow reading Dick's work, which puts you on a little bit of a quest, it puts you on this path where you got to try to make sense of the world that's been disclosed to you in those books. I mean, I teach those books a lot, and I've rarely seen it fail in that people demand to sort of understand the effects that those books have on themselves. And if you start with a kind of impulse like that, then you're not going to be satisfied with the answers in any of the individual extremely specialized termite mounds you were describing earlier, where the academy, but also the corporate sector, all of our kind of chronos reality. Can I call it that? Can I call it like the reality that flourishes in the highly controlled space-time of modernity?
Yes.
That it it carves things up in order to figure out what they're worth very well, of course. But as you were pointing out in your introductory comments, it makes it hard to find the connective spaces. But it's really also not hard because, there's not that many people doing it. So people kind of don't know how to respond to you when you just sort of say, hey, I'm really interested in teaching a course on open source nanotechnology. Right. So when a grant came across my my inbox one day because I became a professor in science, technology, and society. So first answer is I started becoming professor in different administrative units so that I would get different emails, right? That told me about different opportunities. And one of them was a grant on the ethics and environmental and legal and social implications of nanotechnology. I said, would you be interested in a grant on this? I said, well, yes, I would be interested in a grant on that. And so I wrote something up, and they said, well, nobody else prepared anything, so I guess you should go ahead and apply. And I said, oh, great, and once upon a time, and this is part of an answer to your question, Eric, I would have been pissed off. I would have been like, oh, so nobody else did, so you're letting me. Right. Okay, so I would have sort of resentfully put something together and self-thwarted myself as much as possible. But instead I said, great, I'll write something up. And I wrote something up, and they said, well, I just got off the phone with somebody at the NSF, and we need somebody with a tenure line in engineering. And I wrote back, and I said, well, that's great, because I just moved my professorship into science, technology, and society, which is half engineering, half liberal arts. And then, a couple of weeks later, I got an email, well, I just got off the phone with the NSF, and you have to have your original appointment in engineering. So it's like customs inspectors, right? We require the following stamps, right? But it's okay, because if you don't lose your cool with the customs inspectors, they want you to succeed too. They just want to get as much out of you as they can. So, make a long story short, it ended up being a 3-part collaboration between myself, a really awesome guy in engineering design, and the person who runs the nanofabrication facility here, all put together more or less just like by the Noosphere, if I can put it that way, by me not getting angry, playing it to the next level of the video game or the quest, right? And it all got put together, and we just finished the second iteration of that course this semester. And, it's been a remarkable experience, because even when it fails, it succeeds, because, even when, like, say, a presentation doesn't go as well as one might have hoped, you're learning about how to create this third culture, right? You're learning how to create this domain where this isn't such a big chasm, okay? Because, as I said before, if you want to know, if you want to understand your life and you want to understand the world that we're in, you're not going to be satisfied with the answers that any particular one is giving you. And if you are, you should probably stop that.
Yeah, it also seems that part of the answer, and this says something very specific about our time, and I think you can speak to this very well, whether you want to talk about the idea of the Noosphere or any other number of notions, that deeper, more satisfying answer is only found to the degree that it is ever found in the making of it.
Yeah.
And the making of it is not just a matter of ideas in the sense of saying, oh, well, look, there's this connection between, cultural anthropology over here and the fabrication of nanomaterials over there and the economics of globalization over here. Great, you can draw those links, but it's also a matter of how you make those observations and that language real in the world. In other words, for you, how you create space within the institution where the act of making connections between different domains is itself part of the answer.
Yeah, and that's where the students are really the ones that I'm just surfing alongside, because they know that, right? They're coming to the class, and we're still stuck in this model of knowledge transmission rather than knowledge production, prosumption, creation. So they're dying to participate and create the world that they're living in. And so if you just kind of get out of the way, it takes place. It's not always, you have to tune it, you have to work to create these domains, but it does, I think that, like this show itself, the technologies and practices of the Noosphere are making it harder and harder to just go through the motions in other domains, right? It's increased transparency. Like if you can get real knowledge on the web, and then you go to a class and somebody just reads a PowerPoint to you, and there's no participation, and there's no dynamics, and there's no new knowledge created, there's just information that has been, repeated, then you're really not going to put up with it. You're going to wonder, what am I doing here? there must be other ways for me to create my life. And so I think that that's happening. So I'm really actually optimistic about a pretty radical reform, if not revolution, within universities, because I look at it this way. In the north, it's northwest of Pennsylvania. There's something called the Marcellus Shale, where they found about $1 trillion or 14 years worth, unfortunately, of natural gas. Mm. And part of it is that they have new technologies that allow them to extract that gas now, which of course, is setting off all kinds of local problems and contestations. But almost nobody can walk away from $1 trillion. Is that they're able to get new energy out of old sites, basically, right? And I feel that way about the university. I feel like the fact that the university has survived, honestly, and specifically through the past 8 years or so forth, is really good news, and it's survived. But it's nowhere near the sanctuary of sort of creative production and evolution that it could be with just a little, teeny shift of perspective and practice. And so I have every reason to think that we can nudge it there.
Well, I got to say, before I had Rich on here, I asked him to send me some, pointers for possible discussions, and he sent me this wonderful mad poem of, the techno-scientific imaginary. And so I'm kind of tempted just to sort of dive into this, because each little phrase is very inspiring, but kind of along the lines of what we're talking about. You've been sort of describing the noosphere, this concept from Desjardins, as kind of an indication of a sort of growing global mind that's partly facilitated by technology, that has to do with the interconnections between people, between discourses, between fields of knowledge and fields of experience and production in the kind of human space. But I also know you're very interested in plant intelligence, in the sort of wilder ideas of certain psychedelic science folks who see psychedelics and other techniques as being an interface between the human world and the plant world. Can you talk a little bit about that larger context, not just what's happening inside of human knowledge and human technologies of mediation, but the interface between that world and this larger world of plant intelligence?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it links right to the earlier discussion we were having, basically based on first-person science, which is that, if we ever doubt that human beings really are beautiful and remarkable and divine beings as well as cruel beasts at times, we might notice that, we really always do want to know, right? There's a kind of deep desire in us that doesn't, at least some of us, we don't give up, and it's almost like a fetish or a habit or an addiction. It can't be stopped. And so you bring up plant intelligence, which is really interesting in a way because it turns out to not be a really wild idea at all. I know you were talking about the psychedelic science stuff, but in the sense that if you look at the history of even just the scientific interaction with plants. So we, combine that if we to the sort of more or less modern period, you'll see that there's a very robust tradition of scientists that Ernst Haeckel called the tradition of phytopsyche. So this idea that the plant carries out some activities in a way that almost demands that we use the language of intelligence. And, this goes back most interestingly to the German Gustav Fechner, to an interesting character in the sense that he was sort of the inventor he was the inventor of psychophysics, the most kind of reductionist model of living systems you can imagine, where we just try to measure every kind of input and output physiologically of a living system. So he created some of the earliest measurements of different forms of bodily response. And yet he also wrote 2 books on plant souls. and was convinced for the very same reason that you can understand human beings from this perspective of psychophysics, that plants, through all the subtle interactions that he had observed that they had with their environment, were doing the same thing, that they were engaging in some kind of cognizing, knowing activity in their environments. So when I started to do some research, I came up with a veritable kind of genealogy of plant intelligence that shows how robust it is in the scientific tradition, and not with marginal outsiders, although often those people are correct, but people who are squarely in the middle of the history of biology and the history of physics, the history of wireless. An early Indian radio pioneer, Bose, wrote a very interesting book on plant response. Luther Burbank, who you've probably heard of, the agronomist who was single-handedly pretty much responsible for getting kind of plant patent legislation changed in the United States, because he was so fecund creating new plants that he wanted to be able to commodify them.
But he wrote that crazy esoteric book, what was it, Man as a Plant?
Man Conceived as a Plant, I believe.
Yeah, and it's like unbelievably psychedelic.
Yes,
he was good friends with Yogananda, too.
Yeah,
and
totally.
He was tight with Yogananda, exactly. That's how I followed the whole strand, was from Yogananda to Luther Burbank, and then I kept going. And so, what becomes interesting is that now plant intelligence is again a topic in contemporary botany, because for a lot of the technological reasons we've been talking about, right, all the advances in sensors, all the advances in informational models of living systems, our ability to study their nucleic acids and the ribosomes and the proteins, that scientists start to get a close look at what's going on in what's called plant signaling. And, their eyes bug out, because the amount of information flow and transformation and the complexity of that information that's going on there, again, practically demands that they use this language of plant intelligence. So, and they're uncomfortable about it. They think that it's controversial. So I'm trying to contribute by showing, well, actually, no, this is really the return of something which is very mainstream, and maybe we ought to wonder why we ever thought plants were doing anything other than knowing.
Well, Rich, let me ask you, have you been able to integrate, or what do you think about the idea of, like, the fairy face with that plant intelligence? Because, like, part of that primitivity of this idea of plant intelligence, I mean, that goes back, right, to fairy face and assigning consciousness on that. Like, Peter Tompkins, who did that great book, Secret Life of Plants, he also did that book, Secret Life of Nature, where he got into, like, connecting on a quantum consciousness level the fairy face with all those kinds of ideas. Do you get into that at all?
Well, here's what I would say is that same desire to know, right, makes us use our consciousness and use our imagination in productive ways. Let me give you an example. Mm-hmm. We might grow a plant, some plants. Engaging in the practice of growing those plants, we learn that, as Pliny put it, the farmer's eye is the best fertilizer. In other words, you have to interact with the plant. You have to observe the plant. It helps, if you need to observe the plant closely, to, as Teilhard would put it, personify it. Interact with it as if it were conscious, even whether it is or not. And so, when I think about fairy faiths or things like pagan spirituality or Gaian spirituality, then what I think it comes back to is this practice of interaction with nature, right?
And that goes back to the Schrodinger quote you were talking about earlier, how when he looks at the tree, he becomes part of the tree.
Exactly. And you can get better at that. You can get better at dissolving the difference between yourself and nature. And so if we engage in that practice, then our mind needs to come up with scripts for it, right? This is like, John Lilly experimenting in his flotation tanks in the 1960s and investigating LSD, and he said, well, gosh, if I go in and I take as my premise when I'm going in that the existence of an alien deity, things go well. I think I'll do that. Right.
Listen. I just need to cut in here. I want to talk
please.
more about melting the barrier that sort of falsely appears between us and nature. But first, we just want to take a short break where we're going to hear about some of the other programming on Progressive Radio Network. So
beautiful. Take
it away, gentlemen.
To PRN, Progressive Radio Network.
Hi, I'm Richard Martin of the Wake Up Call. We have a new Sunday evening show called Richard Martin's Discussion Group, which airs at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can access it live on www.progressiveradionetwork.com, or you can listen to it on the archives. This is your show and your opportunity to air your thoughts, questions, and rants on the ills of today's economy. There'll be a theme each week, and I want to hear from you. So please, come on in. Sundays, 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and tune in to PRN, the ProgressiveRadioNetwork.com. You have a date with us. See you then.
Hey, did you miss your favorite show? Don't worry, PRN has you covered. Just log on to ProgressiveRadioNetwork.com and go to the archive page where you can choose from any of our great programs. Listen or download shows from yesterday or even ones dating months back. The Progressive Radio Network, striving to make your lives easier.
Hi, I'm Darryl Clark.
Bob Levis.
Ron Waits. And we're your Progressive News Weekly team here on Progressive Radio Network.
Shank of the morning, the shank of the week. Wednesdays, 10 a.m., 11 a.m.
We are you as if you had a mic in your hand the way we do.
It's news you can use. News for you, by you, and of you.
Grassroots activism.
That's all she wrote, folks.
You're listening to the Progressive Radio Network, your number one source for progressive commentary.
All right, folks, we're back. I'm Erik Davis. This is Expanding Mind, and we're talking with Rich Doyle. And we were talking specifically about this question of practices, ideas, concepts, experiences that help dissolve the apparent boundary between human intelligence and the larger natural world of intelligence that's waiting out there, perhaps to leap into our laps with glee, perhaps to terrify us with visions of what's really going on. So talk a little bit more about that magical and in some ways very scientific interface.
Well, what I was talking about before was the, quite magical, I think, but also mundane interface of just growing some eggplant. That you grow that eggplant and maybe you use some compost and you enter into a practical relationship to that plant as it's growing. And flexing that interactive part of ourselves, if I can put it that way, exercising it, puts you on a kind of pathway to improvement. You keep getting better and better and better. When I first started growing some plants after I, got through sort of certain part of the tenure process and so forth, and had been, captured, my attention had been captured by a certain part of the machine for a certain number of years, I noticed that I was, terrible. I wasn't paying attention at all. I was basically just kind of spacing out on my plants. They were dying, this kind of thing. But what you notice is you just sort of cultivate that mode of paying attention. You cultivate getting still and letting go of all the demons that are, occupying your mind and convincing you that you need to try this strategy or that strategy because you feel rightly or wrongly that the world is trying to kill you, basically. And so I would say that practices of dissolution include that kind of what I call to myself just worshiping dirt, just getting around the plants, interacting with the plants, noticing them, becoming an observant interactor. And then at that point you see that when the purple flowers open, they're unbelievable structures, and they're beautiful, and they're able to coax the insects towards them in ways, that are astonishing, in the same way that people can appreciate high fidelity in an old analog tuner or something, you can start to appreciate that in-plant interaction. So that's one way of, I think, dissolving this barrier, seeing that, look, we're growing each other here, right? And that's obviously particularly the case with people, like cannabis breeders like DJ Short, who are growing plants, which, are encouraging him to grow them. There's a kind of feedback loop there. But there's also another more embodied, not more embodied, but kind of highly physical interpretation of this fusion, which I experience most often on the bicycle, which is, making tiny circles with my feet uphill. It no longer is very profitable for me to posit a distinction between myself and the world, because if so, that self is so full of pain that it doesn't want to, it doesn't want to be alone. So I have to give up my autonomy in order to be able to share some of that pain, so it's not just concentrated on my surface. And that's just a strategy for getting up a hill, But you do that every day, and that ordinary, habitual, perceptual view of reality that, as you said, Erik, is false, of our separation from each other and from nature and from the creative production of reality, it withers. It doesn't disappear entirely, because it has its uses, but it withers.
I like that image of you cycling, because of just the image of the wheel spinning around itself is almost a symbol of the process you're describing, because you're not saying that the body that you're in is not experiencing pain, or that there aren't these waves of intensity, but that what's going on is not just your little creatureliness trying to push these external objects to do your bidding, but you're part of this larger cycle of movement, of the asphalt, of the wind, and the whole experience itself is one loop, at one part of which is yourself, as one part of which is the experience of pain, but that it extends much wider. The loops that weave us together, the feedback loops that constitute who we are, stretch so widely and so many, and they're so multi-leveled that all it takes is to shift outside of the grip that we use to hold on to our sense of identity to begin to experience and open up those deeper cycles.
Well, and that brings me to kind of another thing I wanted to talk to Rich about, was the genius way that you use nonsense. Like on your blog and things you write, you go into these kind of nonsensical, jibber-jabbery, Alice in Wonderland-y kind of Dr. Seussy things. And I had the privilege to read this book called The Wisdom of Nonsense by Raymond Moody, who was, he did all the Life After Death.
Was. Yeah.
You can get that actually on his website. It's genius. He worked on it for about 40 years, and he goes through almost every example in history of how people would use nonsense to actually go into ecstatic states and break out of reality.
Yes.
And alter consciousness. And I think that you, talking about like just connecting yourself with cycles in nature, like one of the ways that you do, and I'm sure you do it consciously, is to go into and enjoy and, gleefully enter these nonsensical ways of using words to stimulate that consciousness shift. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I take that as like such high praise, really, that I'm able to that you're able to see that that I'm working on periodically using strategic use of nonsense, the exploration of nonsense. And one of the reasons is because the mainstream philosophical tradition in the English language speaking world has been, at the very least since Wittgenstein, to get rid of nonsense, right? And Wittgenstein was a brilliant genius and amazing to read his thin books, and put them through your head. But it's so bizarre because it's based on such a limited conception of what language can do, which is to have one single meaning. Whereas language obviously evolved in a context where we used it to sing and express as much as we did to produce meaning. So there's an enormous bandwidth, if I can put it that way, in our language that's going unused because we're not exploring it, because we've become convinced that it's a sort of trivial part of our experience. When in fact, it's a way of breaking down our habitual patterns of thought, right, which is extremely a fertile thing to do, and it does so by just taking flight. There's a way in which you start to So maybe you saw my blog that I said yes, friends. Why noun when we can verb?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the reason I say that is because the main thing I try to teach in all of my classes is to just have a smidgen of freedom between what you experience as yourself and your language choice. In other words, you can start to learn that the map is not the territory, right? That you are using words as a tool, right? But those tools are precisely tools and not reality. It's a very hard thing to hold on to. The Zen tradition tries to play with it with koans and so forth, where you have to exhaust the meaning of language before you can see nonsense, basically. But like you said, I just try to do it. I try to weave it through the blog, and I just like to have fun. I like to sort of get dissociated on language, and it seems to be medicinal.
Well, it's also just the wonder of the neologism, which is somewhere halfway between nonsense and poetry and the creation of a link between what were previously unrelated or at least only lightly related fields, and that's a whole other zone where it's almost like kind of active nonsense as opposed to merely scrambling nonsense.
Well, yeah. So, for example, I think I coined the term nanonym for the set of all these words that have emerged with nano as the prefix.
Oh, a nanonym.
Good.
And I did it as a neologista, right, which is somebody who thinks that we need new words for a new world. Mm-hmm. If for no other reason, then it might make us hesitate when we use the other words that we use habitually, like kind of reflex arc. And what I tried to create it for was to remind myself and my students that nanotechnology is first and foremost a discourse. It's just, it has all these ways of doing things, but it's really got worldviews embedded in there. And we ought to find the best of all possible worldviews that we can embed in nanotechnology and cultivate that rather than the bigger, harder, faster, say, view of that is also embedded in there, because it's really a lot of it is just about making faster and faster computers so that you can own battle space. But there's utopian possibilities in there for the effects on photovoltaic cells alone. That we could have such highly distributed, cheap electricity that would be produced not in a central location, but by ourselves in a way that would so liberate parts of this planet as to be, worthy of the name utopian. We'd be able to, we can create filters that will be able to, do desalinization with hardly any energy at all, right? So the ocean can become a freshwater resource for the world that, 61% of the world, I think, doesn't have potable water. So part of what the nonsense can do is help blaze a way through the official discourse, which is just the same old story, right? Which is, let's use this technology for the immortality and triumph of, this elite, or let's have really badass weapons, to protect those interests and so forth. I mean, there's a way in which we can hijack this technology, I hope.
Well, here's a question for you. Since you are, a scholar of technoscience, the rhetoric of technoscience, and therefore the history of the rhetoric of technoscience, you'll know very obviously that it's a common feature of modernity that when significant new technologies emerge, productive technologies, media technologies, that there is often this initial period where there's, like, as you are describing with nanotechnology, where there's actually more discourse than actual technologies on the ground, or they haven't really started to really impact society yet. oftentimes we see this explosion of utopian thinking, visions of possible futures. This is very much true of the Internet. It's true of all media technologies, et cetera. And a even somewhat happy look at modernity will show that it's not often the case that those things hold on. One of the things I like about your approach is that there is a genuine sense of possibility and even utopianism, even as you're looking at a lot of very weird and scary and mind-melding kinds of things. I'm kind of curious about how you feel about, are you a strategic optimist? Does it bubble up naturally from your eggplants? Where does the oomph come from at such a dark time?
What did you say, Masha?
I said you must be a Sagittarius.
No, Scorpio. Close to.
An optimistic Scorpio.
My brother was Sagittarius.
Oh, interesting.
It bubbles, I mean, it's at times strategic, At times I've had to do it on purpose at different points in life. I mean, for the following reason. You probably have heard of the mathematician Paul Erdős. He was the most prolific mathematician in the history of mathematics in terms of the number of theorems and so forth. He lived nowhere, traveled around with a briefcase, and just went and slept on people's couches and worked on their problems. Interestingly, I think at the age of 70, picked up a very extraordinary amphetamine habit. But he was asked one time about the optimism of mathematicians, and he says, "Oh, it's very simple." He said, "If you're a mathematician, you have to be able to look at at problems and see if they're tractable or not tractable, or they're doable or not doable. And the only way you're ever going to attempt a problem is if they're tractable. So the people who are going to look and see and at least think that a problem is tractable have a chance to solve the problem. The people who don't see it as tractable don't even have a chance of solving the problem. Their possibility goes to zero because they won't try it. So there's a certain fecundity to the optimism. But I have to say, I think it's a combination. It started to feed back onto itself. But it's always bubbled there, and I think it's bubbled there for sound experiential reasons. There's the dark vision of Philip K. Dick reminds us that the empire never ended, right? That we're still living in the same kind of regime as year zero in a certain way, just translate ancient Rome to Southern California as he did. But that, the other side of that refrain, the empire never ended, is like, and we're still here. That the light has not died out, if I can put it that way, given your Gnostic course, and that everywhere you look and everywhere you go, you meet people who are engaged in this common project. So that's the sort of experiential side of the optimism. I remember when I first started working on a scholarly project on psychedelics, I got a chance to go and interview and meet with the Shulgins, Alexander and Ann Shulgin. And I spent a couple hours with them, and I was just blown away because, they're amazing people, and they've done amazing things in their lives. And they're incredibly giving. And I knew that if the knowledge that I was studying was involved, emerged from people like this, that I was on some kind of correct, path. And that's proved to be the case, that there are extraordinary people doing extraordinary things in every direction, so that while we don't want to become, starry-eyed and ignore the very real darkness that is, in the hexagram, if I can put it that way, that it's not all that exists either, and we can easily become transfixed by the darkness, particularly at a time when lots of things are starting to connect together, right? We can start to think that
it's funny. I had an interesting experience the other day. I was interviewed on stage. It was sort of like a performance interview where this guy was throwing me questions. Some of them were like totally wacky, like what, which way do I like the toilet roll to go and why and stuff like that. And he asked me about being an optimist or a pessimist. And when I, the more that I unravel my point of view philosophically, culturally, the more, in other words, the more that my intellect is mapping things, the more pessimistic or at least realist I find myself becoming. But the answer that spontaneously emerged about my optimism is that my profound optimism, which also animates my life, comes about almost solely through connections and resonance with other people. That it's the existence of like minds, or of differently engaged like minds, of resonating networks of similar spiritual, psychological, intellectual issues, even interest in dark things, Lovecraft or Philip K. Dick. But there's something about the way that one resonates with others and really recognizes others and sees that creative productivity that's animated by a certain kind of spirit that you cannot deny. That for me, those networks are where the optimism really comes from. And if we are connecting more and more things now, if we are linking up more and more, then those connections, those linkages, those resonances are as much a part of the fabric of our evolving reality as what's happening, or at least they are as important to take account of as some of the more grinding kinds of connections that are coming up. And
the more obviously existing dark forces.
Yeah.
So because I find that's very necessary a lot of the time, both for myself and students, which is that when we start to see things connect, basically the off-the-shelf conceptual tool we have is a conspiracy theory, right? And the psychological correlative of paranoia. And both of those things are instructive, actually, as is the realism that you talked about earlier. It's good to use it to navigate reality, but they're just tools too, right? And sometimes, people, I thought what Robert Anton Wilson said about belief was absolutely correct, which is just the obstacle to life. So the point of, mapping the connections is to not, arrive at some conclusion concerning the nature of the forces making those connections, but to, ride those connections, continue those connections, and proliferate them.
Well, as a Gnostic fan, even though we only have about 5 minutes left, I'm curious about another one of your phrases here, which was involutionary Gnosticism. Want to unpack that one in 3.5 minutes?
Yeah. This grew out of a paper I wrote on human-plant interaction about cannabis, and what I was trying to emphasize with that involution idea is, and I found out later that this is a term that Aurobindo uses. I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
But which is that, for me at least, it was really helpful to come to the conclusion that there's a way in which we use our minds and our bodies to manipulate things and know things in the external world, where external is a word. But there's also a way in which we use our mind and our consciousness and our bodies to manipulate an internal world, again, words, which is more characteristic of the sort of yogic or imaginal realms. And I have found that the idea of involution, that what I'm doing is folding in upon myself and exploring this enormous galactic space within of consciousness in a kind of thoroughgoing way, practically and every day in experience, that this involution becomes a kind of good word for me to remember and kind of metaprogram in Wilson's terms what I'm doing. That I find that I find a lot of times people forget that they find it a hard time to remember that that their internal world is in many ways as real, if not more real, than their external world. So I've had to try to play around with language to help remind myself of that.
What are some other tricks you pull in order to keep that aspect of things rolling along in the midst of all of the tremendous amount of external work that you do?
I shut up long enough to mutate. I sit in meditation pretty daily and turn it off through biking or swimming. I think that we really all need to learn how well we thrive when we turn our switches off for a while. I think it's instructive that the local internet company here, something like 95% of all of the support calls that they get can be solved by just rebooting the cable modem. I think that's probably true in our, somewhat more elaborate, but probably also simply governed subjectivities, that we need to turn it off and restart. So
do you practice
that's
the same thing
with
media? You know, are you aware of like sometimes not having your cell phone or not going online?
Yeah. I've become a Himalayan in a cave. You know, in that regard, I turn everything off for very long periods of time because otherwise, you know, you start to you just let yourself get yanked. You know, you're just constantly responding to the contents of your own mind, basically. So yeah, I mean, I love it when it's on, but then I turn it off.
Great. We just got a couple minutes here, and I just want to say we've been talking to Rich Doyle, and your website is Biotelemetrica.
Yeah.
And then what? You got some stuff coming out. You just edited a journal about psychedelic science, and you have a book coming out.
A journal on Johns Hopkins University Press called Configurations, and you can get it off Project Muse. You can ask at your library. It was an attempt to get some scholarship on the history and psychology of psychedelics. So that took 7 years, but was interesting. I have a book coming out in 2010 on University of Washington Press called An Ecodelic Hypothesis, which is a work of first-person science about psychedelics.
Beautiful.
And, you know, lots of things flying. I'll try to keep up better with your website because there's just so much to learn. But I have a lot of gratitude for you guys having me on today.
Well, I really appreciate it, Rich. You're doing exactly the kind of thing that this show is about, and what I mean by a culture of consciousness, you know, this sort of hermetic, mercurial path between different domains, and where the path itself is a dance that inspires and resonates across different fields. So I really thank you for taking time to be with us. And my website is www.techgnosis.com, and we've been talking to Dr. Mobius, a.k.a. Rich Doyle. And thanks again, guys, and we'll see you next week with Andy Stack, a magician from the UK, so it should be fun. All right.